Brazil is the world's fourth largest democracy. So what happens in Brazil doesn't just affect Brazil, but it also sends significant messages out to democracies across the globe.
Now, when Lula da Silva was serving nearly 2 years in prison for corruption, he could hardly have dreamed that this day would come. But his conviction was annulled, and the left-winger is leader of Brazil again after very narrowly beating President Bolsonaro. Let's speak to Jonathan Bonfiglio, who's the Times' Latin American correspondent. Good morning to you.
Good morning, Asma.
Is there a problem? Do you foresee problems because the margin of victory was so tight?
I think it's a really interesting question. I mean, the very fact that Bolsonaro has not conceded defeat, clearly they've planned for this. His team has planned for this, prepared for this. So at some point, he's going to come out and say something, and we pretty much know which way it's going to go. To some extent, the question is how loud, aggressive are the noises that he and his team make about the integrity of the election. What's interesting at the moment is that his broader ecosystem of supporters isn't really out there, or hasn't really last night been out there questioning too loudly what took place, despite the narrowness of the victory, which, it's worth saying, is the tightest election race in Brazilian history. Another way of looking at it, however, is that the very nature of this election, again, the thin margins involved, means that half of Brazil fundamentally doesn't really believe in the democratic project as it stands. And so the damage to democracy isn't something which is for the future, it's something which is highly present now.
Also, in terms of President da Silva's kind of legislative program, things that he wants to get through, that's going to be difficult, isn't it?
You're absolutely right, and not just difficult because of what broad mandate does he have when the win was so narrow, but also because on the 2nd of October, when the first round of the presidential election took place, there was also a series of Senate elections and gubernatorial races also being undertaken, in which a significant amount of Bolsonaro's supporters, acolytes, people who think like him as well, won Senate seats. So they control the Senate as well. So Lula pushing through his progressive agenda is going to really struggle. Having said which, I mean, Lula very quickly came out last night and, as you would expect, said that he was going to rule on a mandate for all Brazilians, not just half of Brazil, and that it was in nobody's interest for Brazil to be infighting every day of the next 4 years. But whether Bolsonaro's supporters actually listen to that, because they do fundamentally believe that the election, well, most of them believe that the election is invalid in some way. And they also believe that Lula and his party were involved in the biggest corruption scandal, again, in Brazilian history, which is an accurate statement. I mean, that scandal ran for a process of about 10 years, which led to, as you've correctly said, Lula being in prison for a period of almost 2 years.
Just on that, why was his conviction annulled? On what grounds?
It was annulled on the grounds that it was politically motivated and that it was basically an invalid sentence that was set down. The judge at the time, Sergio Moro, was then the justice minister in Bolsonaro's administration and a big supporter of his right-wing agenda. So it was broadly seen, even at the time. I mean, there was no question that Lula's party was broadly involved in the corruption scandal, but whether Lula himself was involved was much more of an open question. And also you can really tell that because Lula won this election not because of his party, but despite his party, because it is still fundamentally tainted by that scandal. And it was what Bolsonaro was using throughout the campaign in terms of his attacks on Lula, saying that he was a crook and that they were just in it to debase the Brazilian economy and people.
So finally, what direction then, we know he's a left-winger, but what direction policy-wise will Lula take Brazil, for example, on the economy and on climate?
Yeah, I mean, he's much more of a, despite him coming from the Workers' Party, he's much more of a I guess, sort of temperate centre leftist figure, and that was certainly the case. I mean, there's a clue in terms of the 2 terms that he served between 2003 and 2011.
Mm.
He is of standard left, I guess, at the moment in terms of a post-COVID context, and especially a sort of war in Ukraine, Russia, inflation, stifling economies globally in terms of opening up markets, reinvesting in people and economies, and so on. I think that the really key things, or the things which we're going to see most of with Lula da Silva in news cycles, relate to the Amazon, of course, and the very fact that, and protecting the Amazon, he's already said that he doesn't want to be Brazil to be a champion in deforestation, but he wants Brazil to be a champion in understanding and believing that climate change is happening and responding accordingly. And also the fact that Brazil largely has become a sort of an international pariah over the last 4 years. And so he's already, in fact, but he will be undertaking a series of moves to kind of re-establish its standing. Again, just as a final statistic, I mean, it is important to remember that Brazil is the world's 4th largest democracy. So what happens in Brazil doesn't just affect Brazil, but it also sends significant messages out to democracies across the globe.
Yes, absolutely. Jonathan, thank you. That's Jonathan Bonfiglio, who is the Times' Latin America correspondent.